Before we get started, welcome to 2018. I'm glad that you're back. And to start off the year, I thought we'd get a little bit closer, hence the slight change in setup. Anyway, a while back, I made a video about the 42.5 1.7 and I compared that to the Lumix G7 kit lens. At that point, there were plenty of reviews for that lens. However, if I was just starting out, I still wouldn't be able to gauge how much of an improvement it would be over the kit lens. Start of 2018, we're gonna do another one of those videos, so you can skip over to the end if that's your thing. Otherwise, go grab some popcorn, get comfortable, because today we've got a big one. Today we're comparing the Lumix G7 kit lens over the infamous Panasonic 20mm 1.7. Yo, it's Kim, and I thought we'd start off with some background. So firstly, why would we buy a standard prime? For reference, a portrait lens like the 42.517 can blow out the background. That's what portrait lenses do. But a standard lens can't necessarily do that to the same extent, which begs the question, why even bother buying a standard prime? Specifically, the 20mm 1.7. Typically the answer is two things: better low light performance and sharper images. Historically, primes are always sharper than zooms because there's less elements in the lens. Because of that, it's also easier to fit a bigger aperture. However, today we're gonna put that to the test. Secondly, the 20mm 1.7 is one of the older lenses in the system. Classic, if you will. And in fact, there's two versions now. I'm using version 2. There's not much of a difference between version 1 and 2. In fact, version 1 tested sharper on DxO. But if you're in the market, search for version 1 first, save yourself some cash. Thirdly, most of my tests were done with stills, but for most of the things we're talking about today, it also applies for video. For things like AF speed and stabilization, I talk about those separately between stills and video. Okay, so here's 5 key aspects to consider when comparing the Lumix G7 kit lens with the 20mm 1.7. Low light. So let's get the boring stuff out of the way first. A bigger aperture means more light hits your sensor. You can determine this by the f-stop number. If it's lower, that means more light's actually getting to your sensor. So say if it's f1.7, that's gonna be bigger than an f3.5. I know, it's confusing. Yes! Having a bigger aperture is definitely gonna improve your low light performance, but keep in mind, there's a chance that some of the subjects aren't going to be in focus because of the shallower depth of field. Kit lens gets a point here as well because it's got image stabilization. However, in my experience, it doesn't really help too much in low light conditions, but it's worth mentioning. Bottom line, the 20mm is definitely better in low light. However, with that shallower depth of field, just have to be extra careful with that focus. The 20mm takes this round. Next up is usability and versatility. Now both lenses are light, but the kit lens is 110 grams and the 20mm is 87 grams. That's 3.1 ounces versus 3.9 ounces. That isn't substantial, you're not gonna feel it. Now when it comes to zooming, obviously the 20mm is a prime, it can't zoom. And if you've ever been out and about and you wanted to change lenses, you know how much of a hassle that can be. So in terms of these aspects, the kit lens is definitely better. Now if you really want to get closer to your subject, the kit lens wins hands down because even though they have the same 20cm minimum focusing distance, the kit lens has the ability to zoom. This is important for macro type shots and product photography. Bottom line here is the kit lens is better than the 20mm because it doesn't weigh too much more, you can zoom, you don't need to change lenses, plus you can get closer to your subjects, and there's going to be less distortion and longer focal length. That's going to be good for product photography and the like. For this round, the kit lens takes it. Moving on to sharpness and color, this is where things start to get really interesting. For all these shots, I tried to keep the settings the same as possible. However, if the light changed, obviously I needed to adjust my shutter speed. Also, I shot everything in JPEG and in the natural shooting profile. Oh, and they're all straight out of camera. In this first test, I just wanted to see the difference in color and the quality of the bokeh. For this, I had to set both lenses to f4.5 because that's the widest the kit lens would shoot at 20mm. I found that the 20mm 1.7 tends to shoot cooler than the kit lens, and the quality of the bokeh isn't necessarily creamier, but the bokeh balls on the edge tended to be more jagged on the 20mm, whereas on the kit lens, it tended to be more cat eye-like. So for this next test, I just wanted to test sharpness on a wider shot. So I shot everything at either f4.5, 5.6, or f8. The reason being is if I was shooting landscapes, these are the exact apertures I'd be using. Now at f4.5, 20mm shows more contrast in both the center and the edges. I won't go as far as saying it's sharper. When you zoom in, there's hardly any difference in sharpness. Without zooming, you can hardly tell which lens you're using, aside from the colors being warmer on the kit lens. Now at f5.6, the 20mm again shows more contrast in the center and the edges, but it's really academic. At f8, I can't tell the difference between the two lenses aside from the colors. DP review and imaging resource may be able to see the difference in sharpness, but in my test, I definitely can't. Bottom line, the 20mm provides sharper images according to more scientific tests. However, in my test, I just saw more contrast and a difference in color rendering. Now, if I didn't consider color, I'd have a really hard time telling the difference between the two lenses unless I really zoom in and look for a difference in contrast. And for that reason, I'm calling this round a tie. Next up is probably the sexiest category here, and that's shallow depth of field. Now, if you've seen my video on the 42.517, you know just how much that lens can blow out the background compared to the kit lens. But standard lenses don't blow out the background like that, so how does the 20mm compare to the kit lens in this regard? For this test, I took 3 shots. The first 2 with the exact same settings on both lenses at f4.5. However, for the third shot, I shot the 20mm at 1.7 because why not? So with both lenses set to f4.5, I actually found the kit lens creamier in the out of focus areas. The kit lens tends to have cat eye bokeh balls on the edges, but around the center they tended to be more circular than the 20mm. The 20mm bokeh balls tended to show more edges from the aperture blades, and they both have 7 aperture blades. Don't look at me, I can't explain this one. And just for kicks, I set the 20mm to its maximum aperture at 1.7. Here you can see the 20mm bokeh balls being much rounder than they are at f4.5. What I wanted to show here was just how much blurry the background could be between an f1.7 and an f4.5. Bottom line, the kit lens can almost blow out the background just as much as the 20mm 1.7. However, you're gonna have to get pretty close to your subject and you're gonna have to go all the way to the end of your zoom range. Also, the kit lens tended to have more cat eye bokeh balls on the edges of the frame, but overall more circular, while the 20mm tended to have more jagged bokeh balls at the same apertures as the kit lens. However, stop the 20mm up to 1.7 and the bokeh balls become round, and for this reason, I'm calling the 20mm the winner, but just barely. Lastly, and probably one of the most important, AF speed and stabilization. So for autofocus speed and stills, the 20mm is definitely slow. Almost all reviews have touched on this. In 2018, this is definitely a slow focusing lens. On the other hand, the kit lens is fast as yes. If the kit lens were a sniper on CSGO, he'd definitely take me out. Heck, if the 20mm was a sniper on CSGO, he'd take me out as well. I suck at gaming. Now moving on to autofocus for video, generally I don't use this, but if I did, I wouldn't use the 20mm because it's slow and it's noisy. On the other hand, the kit lens focuses faster and it's silent. However, I don't really use autofocus for video anyway, so this aspect doesn't really matter to me. Moving on to stabilization for stills, the kit lens has OIS, so that's helpful, but it's only really about a stop. I don't really find it that helpful. Where it makes a difference for me is in video. For wider focal lengths like 20mm, I prefer to have dynamic or moving shots, and using the 20mm, the footage is clearly more shaky than with the kit lens. Now with a non-stabilized body like the Lumix G7, this is really where stabilization makes a big difference for me. The bottom line here is the autofocus is definitely better on the kit lens for both video and stills, and in terms of stabilization, it does offer some tangible benefits for stills, but not as much as the Prime. However, where it really stands out is in video. I know what you're thinking. How can it be a tie? What does this all mean? So wrapping this up, I learned how far technology has really come and how the 20mm 1.7 is really a great symbol for all standard primes of the past. So going back to that question I asked in the intro, why buy a standard prime? Well, the typical answers are low light performance and sharper images. After these tests, it's clear we still have that low light advantage, and that's a really big draw. But we don't necessarily get sharper images unless we're really looking. In the days of sharp zooms and stabilization, standard primes are becoming more of a novelty. But before you discount standard primes altogether, particularly the 20mm 1.7, I'd like to leave you with this, that for however dated standard primes feel, they're still sexier than kit lenses. There's a certain draw to something that's well made, but limited. Something that's functional, but not the latest and greatest. It's the inconvenient classic car versus the more practical minivan of the kit lens. Yeah, it's not going to handle all your everyday needs, but it's gonna turn some heads and remind us that classic isn't necessarily about being old. It's about never going out of style. I hope you enjoyed this. Have a great 2018.